hope the recording works the way it should. It seems to be. Uh, I don't know. And the other class, and I think it has more to do with the room over there. I'm going to have to get the tech people in. I mean, it's just going so fast. There's something with a setting on that on the record, and that not in here, but in the other. So I have to use yours frequently. So I'll try to make it as clear as possible. And so here we go. So you'll recall today is basically dedicated to RNA viruses. The common denominator with not all, but many RNA viruses is that they mutate. Replication of RNA in our bodies and in our cells is not nearly as impacted by genetic safeguards. When we replicate DNA, and this is one of the units I usually do before this, but I think it's the one I'm going to try to do separately and make sort of like a take-home vehicle for it. We have a lot of our cells, karyotic cells, have a lot of genetic safeguards to prevent mutations of DNA. We have surveillance systems that are special enzymes. One's fancy name is called DNA polymerase 3. That are much more significant than bacteria. Bacteria mutate, and viruses mutate thousands of times more frequently than our cells do. You've heard me say this. We make billions of cells every day. We make an occasional mutation. Our immune system, DNA polymerases, enzyme system. There's a variety of things why, even though we make cells all the time, why we get relatively few mutations that present or cause us trouble. What causes the trouble, and we talk about it a little bit this year, what causes the trouble more than anything else is we create problems for it. We may have a bad immune system, that's fine, but a lot of times it has to do with toxins, smoking, alcohol, all those bad things environmentally, or environmental places where one may work. And now there's a lot of things about that. But for now, RNA is not like that. RNA does not have all those built-in safeguards. It just inherently mutates more. Hence, RNA viruses, and the perfect example are going to be the different kinds of influenza, and we have a little bit today on COVID, which are called coronaviruses. That's where it kind of gets its name, the big C. And so that's sort of the frame for today. We start with the one that really doesn't mutate a lot. Okay, so remember I talked about it earlier. I gave you the anecdote about rotavirus and the fact that it's just so prevalent in certain areas. Not so much here. Interestingly, there is an immunization. I do not think it's part of the main immunization panel for babies and children, because we have started, as our population has changed, we started to see patterns of increasing degrees of rotavirus in areas that were in common to. So, I mean, that's interesting. I remember the anecdote about happening to adults. But, I mean, that was, and the bottom line again, that if you travel and you travel with small children, particularly relatively newborn children, CDC has a website for all of these things. You can look and see what's there, why you might want to be careful, why. Basically, the US probably should have done that in the first place. And then, and so I talked about that. Again, we don't care anything about the strands of this. It's a naked virus, so it spreads easily. And the same thing I told you about norovirus and cruise ships and GI, and that really survives along the surfaces. The most common players are what we have, picos, teeny tiny, extraordinarily small RNA viruses. They're naked, they're isometric, and they common cold. Two categories, major categories. Rhino nose viruses. They're spread respiratorily, as you might think, and there are hundreds of different types of colds. That's what we don't have. For no good, why would we have a cold? One, there's so many types, you couldn't make a vaccine for them. And two, why would you? You're not going to die from cold. And making the point of risk having of an immunization is greater than the risk of having a cold. If we want to do something, if nothing else, understand my frame, I'm not a big vaccine advocate. Vaccines have problems. They're not innocent. And we'll get to a little bit of that discussion, particularly we get the influenza down the road. And just to let you know, it's not like, oh, this will never hurt you. Believe me, when you're playing with your immune system, you're playing with fire. You don't know when you didn't start immune yet in AD. Oh, that's really hard to do. So those are the colds. Nothing to it. We all know what a cold is. We'll go over to respiratory. Entero. Entero means enteric gastrointestinal, from fecal to oral. Basically, the things we eat, when you call a stomach food, there is no such thing. It is basically a viral gastroenteritis. Extremely common. It's easy to get. It goes around all the time. There's nothing special about it whatsoever. A lot of it does have to do with food handling and food preparation. Again, I sort of laugh and joke with you, but if it says pre-wash and you have the opportunity to wash it, okay, wash the exterior of fruits and vegetables. You got to. Just do it. Don't even think about that stupid spray they're doing. Let's just keep it moist and fresh and giant eagle in places. Being silly if you don't do that. It's really good. You take that extra step. It's not that giant a step. Okay? Even from a dorm room perspective, they have these collapsible colanders. You can buy it cheaply on Amazon. Yeah. Just mind what you're doing when you're doing that stuff. Okay? Because that's basically the way they spread. So they're fairly common, and depending on the person, the very old and the very young, if it's a severe one, it can cause some pretty significant fluid and electrolyte imbalance. I mean, if someone was really at risk, any of these things could have potentially fatal complications. Not necessarily themselves, but it has to do with the patient themselves. The two big players historically that you must know, I'll get to polio and hepatitis A. Here are some oddballs, and I put them down for context, not on an exam. Coxsackie and Kawasaki viruses. They're pretty exotic. They can cause some really severe problems when you don't see them that often. You have to test for them. There's an index of suspicion. Those are the kinds of things that it's like when you can't account for why a gastrointestinal illness is much more severe, then you start looking from a diagnostician standpoint. When we do a workup for things, we look at exotic viruses because the testing is very expensive, etc. We get to the two that are most common. Polio, we're all immunized. Polio is extraordinarily topical because here the immunization came from research done at the University of Pittsburgh. A very famous researcher named Salk. One of his medical residents happened to teach here for many, many years. He was teaching here when I started here 20 years ago. Just about, first name was Norbert. I forget what his last name was. Brilliant. I mean, somebody who's got to write up somewhere if I remember his last name. He was actually teaching micro when I started here 20 years ago. So you're getting it from the source. Polio is a scourge. We didn't know how it spread. Polio is spread fecal to oral. It is not contagious in the sense that we do it. People didn't know anything about it. It was something called infantile paralysis. So someone would literally kind of feel, I feel kind of, and it was typically a child, and they would wake up in the morning, couldn't move their legs. They did not, and everybody thought, oh, back in the day, back before we knew how these things spread, they would shun people with polio. People wouldn't go anywhere near the house. They did that for a lot of things. We're a little bit more educated, thankfully, now. What happens, it is absorbed through the gastrointestinal tract, but it poisons, for lack of a better term, nerves, motor nerves going to muscles, so they don't work at all. And what happens is muscles effectively were paralyzed, and unlike a stroke where it's spastic paralysis, this is flaccid, meaning the signal is not getting there. Go back and think about your muscles unit. The signal is not getting there. What happens over time when any of them regain strength, the flexors always overpower extensors, and people would get these awful flexion contractions over time, and there was a lot of surgical intervention for those who survived. These are people because when it affected respiratory, they couldn't breathe. We didn't have the respirator intubation kind of technology then. They put them in a device called an iron lung. So basically, they were sealed in the chamber, and the chamber would basically create a vacuum and pull out their chest. I treated patients with COVID. The immunization became available in, I'm going to say, 1955-ish. It was given by injection. That's why it wasn't as effective, because it wasn't spread that way. And this is a very interesting anecdote that I share with everybody because I'm the right age. Everybody else teaching probably isn't of that age for the most part, unless you have somebody of my generation. And when Salk stopped his research, after his vaccine, they tweaked it at the university in Pittsburgh. It was called by a colleague of his, or it might have been a relative named Sabin, Sabin. And they discovered that it was oral. And imagine this, because everybody had been vaccinated for polio with these injections. And we had a campaign, I'm going to tell you, it was 1965, where the entire country was re-immunized, re-vaccinated, if you want to use that term, for polio again. On a monthly basis, we were given 3 immunizations. How was it administered? Oral. That's how it's given to babies. They put it in their mouth. That's because it works in that system. We went to, it was like a community effort, a national effort. You go to your church, we went to the high school, all the doctors and all the nurses in the community were there. They had the population, they had the census. You came in and they checked off, and they gave you a little, it was a sugar. You may have seen them in the store. They put a drop of this vaccine, and you basically watched you take it and let it dissolve in your mouth. That's exactly how it was given. To give you an idea of how the times have changed. One of those, I was having a sleepover at a buddy's house. My dad called his dad. I was 14. My dad called his dad in the morning and said, "Hey, we're going over to high school this morning, and you want us to pick up Luke?" And I remember my buddy's dad, his buddy of mine's an attorney, I still have to know. I said, "No, don't worry. We'll bring Lou over." "Okay, we'll tell the people there that you're bringing him in." And then I went with them, and they gave me the sugar cube because, my dad and my mom and dad were here. Can you imagine getting a vaccine at 14 years old without your mom and dad present? Can you imagine the legal ramifications today? It's like you can't even think about it. You vaccinated my kid without me present. Imagine. That's a time. And I tell you, many of you this because most of you are pursuing healthcare careers. Be wary. Be very wary. To make sure everything, that you have the appropriate permissions, the consent forms are signed, That's the teaching lesson here. Why take a little time? The other one, hepatitis A. Yeah, okay. Hepatitis A is, comparatively speaking, is not nearly as problematic. Not by any means not fatal. As we'll get to a little bit more hepatitis A. Hepatitis A is fecal to oral. Okay? We used to call it infectious hepatitis. It was sort of a misnomer. Again, it came from the food supply. Right now, there is an immunization for it, and there's certainly adequate treatment, which there was not a whole lot of. Typically, it comes with a severe form of like vomiting and diarrhea, and the typical signs of hepatitis means it inflames the liver, so people get jaundice, they get kind of yellow. It is by no means as innocent as you thought, and now most people get this hepatitis A immunization. The worst lethal outbreak in this country in recent memory was here. It's another one of those Pittsburgh stories. It managed to close an already bankrupt chain of Mexican-style Mexican-American restaurants, whatever, Tex-Mex, called Chi-Chi's.
My high school teacher, he got hep
from Beaver Falls from
yes.
Chi-Chi's. There was a Chi-Chi's people stopped at, and one of the problems, it was right off the turnpike exit in Beaver Falls. Oh wow, we'll go over there a couple of miles off the exit. And so think of how these things spread. He ended 1,000 people were infected. Okay, 4 people died, and it wasn't just the very old or very young. I mean, so that, thank you for. I mean, so you didn't have to be there. And what happened was Chi-Chi was already in bankruptcy. It was a really neat chain from the early days before we had so many different ones that were there. Now they're everywhere, and it and they still make under that label salsa and thing you can buy in any grocery store. It came from their sal. It didn't come from their salsa. They were using green onions, scallions, spring onions, whatever you want to call them. We buy them everywhere. And the big people got, oh, they came from Mexico. Believe me, didn't matter where they came from. All foods, the green onions you buy today still come from Mexico. All foods that come like that have to go through what's called, this is the washing, what's called a power wash. They pick them in the fields in this country and in Mexico. Don't be grossed out too much. So if you see your food comes from California, there are no porta potties in the field. Get the idea? There's a lot of, people just go. Don't blame the workers or anything. They're doing it on the cheap. You're supposed to wash everything. It's a power wash with water. For whatever reason, this was not done properly. And so it would have been a no incident at all if they were put in and cooked, or if they put in salsa, which has a tremendous amount of acidity. I mean, lime juice alone would be sufficient. These were used as garnish on top of dishes. So very often you'll chop up, sprinkle them over. It looks good on the plate. Bad for your digestion. That's where they came from. I mean, we do that. I do that all the time. I do a lot of different things with green onions. I cook some of them. I use them for garnish, things like that. When we make a lot of dishes at home, everybody does. The thing is, wash them. Even if they says pre-washed, it was all about the washing that was done there. With those kinds of things, you can chop them and wash them. It's even better. Because things that grow in the ground, like onions like that, it's like in leeks and things like that. If you're familiar with using those, you have to find sand, kind of dirt stuff in. Watch the videos on how to wash it. That was hepatitis A. 4 people died. And it's by no means the kind of hepatitis we worry about. Okay, it's not something you're going to get from a transfusion or from a needle stick or anything like that. Fecal to oral. Once you understand how things spread, you understand how to contain them. But so that ends the naked viruses. Everything else is enveloped. Okay, and we'll start with one that is it's less problematic. I'm not going to ask you about chikungunya, but it's something we're starting to hear about. It came from Africa. It's carried by mosquitoes, which means it's vector-borne, zoonotic. And what happens in transport going across the Atlantic, we began to see a lot of cases of this. It's by no means fatal. Okay. Basically, just people get very sick, but they do recover unless they really have pre-existing diseases. So keep an eye out for that, particularly if you travel. I mean, I don't know if anybody you're going away. I mean, when I had spring break, we didn't go away at all, like things like that. But it was, nowadays people will, depending on, their financial ability or their family's financial ability, they'll take a trip to the islands and things like this. This is the time of year we see that. So you typically see it in the Caribbean. If you're traveling in that direction to warm weather for any reason, mosquitoes are not your friend. Take precautions like that. If you go to one of these kind of places where you're not staying in some type of fancy hotel and you want to take something a little more rustic, mosquito netting is important. Believe me, because there's a whole lot of things that you're going to see today that are mosquito borne. Nevertheless, rubella is the big player in this for our purposes. It's enveloped. Rubella causes German measles. It is a minor, when we get to it in skin diseases, it's relatively minor. The biggest thing about it and why we are all immunized successfully with MMR, the R and MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella, okay, is because of the severity and the severe impact of what it does to the unborn child. It is spread very easily to someone who is pregnant. And the biggest problem with it, even though the symptoms are mild, you don't notice it, this low grade fever and this relatively minor rash that you have until you've already been sneezing and coughing a little bit. And it's very easy if you're with somebody who is pregnant or is going to be pregnant, and it is devastating the impact in the first trimester. We'll get to more. That's the big player with rubella. If you and I got the German measles, and I did, you hardly even know you had it. Maybe you missed a day of school, maybe two. But you're contagious before, I mean contagious after, and that's something we're going to discuss as we go on in this chapter. I probably have 2 more lectures worth of this chapter, so I'm trying to go a little rapidly to get all this information in. Okay, flavivirus. I wrote it over there. That one over there. Flava means yellow. That's where flavus, flavoproteins, and riboflavin, which is a vitamin in the vitamin B category. I think it's B2. Have a yellowish color. So it gets its name from the color. That's the way they named it originally. So particularly because a lot of these diseases impact the liver. And jaundice, known as yellow jaundice, if you didn't get to digestive yet, certainly, but when you begin to learn about that, what it does is it creates an excessive amount of bilirubin, and things like that can infect the liver and back up into your bloodstream. Gallstones can cause that, liver disease can cause that, liver infections can cause that, blood disorders can cause that, all of the above. Nevertheless, yellow fever was the one. We first heard about yellow fever in this country when they went to dig the Panama Canal in the late 1880s, 1890s, that era. I don't know when it opened, around circa 1900, to connect the Atlantic and the Pacific. Very interesting. The natives there, because remember, it's a rainforest, basically. Everybody was coming down with this sickness, and they didn't know it was mosquito borne. It was vector borne with mosquitoes, and they didn't really know a treatment. The natives then introduced them to a plant which was made quinine alkaloids, and that has been a very, very valuable treatment, not just for yellow fever, but also for malaria. So we get into antivirals and some history about these things. It plays a significant role. Right now, for our purposes, these are enveloped viruses. Many of them are spread by vectors. Dengue, another one that's significant. This is the kind of thing, if you want to go on one of those fleeps, we used to call them, like with a lot of the nursing folks they used to go to Nicaragua, not so safe. Now you're going to Ecuador. This is the kind of stuff you have to be aware of. Okay? Don't be dumb like I did with rotavirus and my kid, all those many years ago. Please. They said, no one I am a mess up of all time sometimes. Okay? So that's dengue. Zika, which you're hearing about, which sort of reared its ugly head, led to microcephaly in certain children, though by no means fatal, was a pretty significant birth defect. And it's made its way into this country, particularly into Miami, after the World Cup and after the Olympics in Brazil. I mean, so that people who were carrying this infection undoubtedly were bitten by it. Was really in a sub-community of Brazilian and Latin folks, which are a large and abundant part of the population in that portion of Florida. And from what I was seeing, there was little cluster breakouts of this Zika. And so that's something interesting historically. The one that is not is the one that you probably have to be most concerned about. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is hepatitis C. Unlike numbers, hepatitis, for whatever reason we do letters, hepatitis B and hepatitis C are interesting because they are both sexually transmitted. Years ago, we were all worried about hepatitis B. Now it's hepatitis C. For years, we didn't have an effective treatment for hepatitis C. I'll go into that a little bit more as time rolls on with regard to some of the problems that are associated with it. We have a lot better treatments for hepatitis C. Beware. The is something that, I mean, I do my blood lecture when I do A&P, or certainly I do my advanced business, we spend a fair amount of time discussing this particular type of hepatitis. This is something that with hepatitis B and hepatitis C spread sexually, both associated with liver cancer. Remember, I sent you a handout I made up like last year or 2 years ago. You got it this morning. All that stuff's on there. So I want you to be wary of that. I told you about my first wife with hepatitis C. Yes, no? I did. Yeah, so I think she got it from transfusions, myself, just because of the time frame. But it was discovered, thankfully, when she was working at the nursing home. She was right under the directors of nursing, so she was, in charge of a lot of the nursing, as many of you might be. And we would not have found out that she had been exposed. It was like one of those. My wife at the time was very dismissive, as smart as she was about these things. Oh, I feel fine. Look, insurance wise, you have to go to occupational health. When you go to occupational health, when you get a blood spatter or get a stick, always, 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 always report it. Don't let somebody who's super, I don't want to do the paperwork. It's the only thing that protects you, okay, is filing an incident. Don't let somebody tell you because they don't want to make it look like, oh, my department's in trouble. The only thing that protects you, because if you get sick, that's the only thing that will cover your proverbial tush. Bottom, rear end. That back there. Derriere. Rumpus. Just permanent vertical smile, fleshy part, fame and song and story. That's an old line from the TV show MASH, these many years ago. I wasn't that clever to create it. The directors of nursing insisted she went to occupational health. They screened for HIV, they screened for hepatitis B, they screened for hepatitis C, and a few other infectious diseases. Bang, hep C positive. I got a call, as you might imagine. I was adjuncting at another place in tears before I got the job here. Oh my God, I'm going to die. I mean, it's the first thing you would think of. I have hepatitis C. I was tutoring the daughters of a husband and wife team. This was before I was working here full time. And she was a nephrologist at AGH, and he was the infectious disease physician at Butler. Okay? We'll talk about smart. We went to see him, and thankfully, he reassured us, and we did the program. Again, if you make antibodies if you've been exposed, that's what they tested for. You have to do RNA or DNA PCR tests to see if you're carrying it in your bloodstream, which she was not. And periodically, she has to be retested for that. Just giving you an idea. Don't be afraid, but if someone is hep C positive, or you're going to somebody with chronic or what they call persistent hepatitis C, you have to take the appropriate precautions. Never play fast and loose with the rules. There's some things you can play fast and loose with. You'll learn shortcuts. Don't start with shortcuts. Learn about shortcuts. We all use them. But for the time being, go by the book until you become 5 to 10 years down the road where you're more experienced. I'm telling you this sincerely. If you have, maybe Dr. McGran could give you some information about that. With her spin on it, with regard to being a physician herself, probably has more experience clinically for those that have her for A&P. Okay, be interesting to see what her spin on it. Okay, moving on. We spend a whole unit on respiratory and coronavirus. A lot of you have had coronaviruses. They're cold viruses. They're not really isometric. You can see from the illustration, they're kind of funky looking. This is the ones that would technically classify as clear. It is an RNA virus. This is what's interesting, and when we get to RSV, we get to influenza, we get coronaviruses. This particular kind of strand of RNA is easy to make changes. We're going to talk about things, it's more appropriate when we talk about influenza, something we call antigenic shift and drift. Shifts are where you have, it's the classic, it's probably, assuming that this was not created in a laboratory, which I have no, not certainly making that assumption. But COVID-19 had a variety of different animal RNA. It had bat RNA, it had farm animal RNA, it had human RNA. And what happens, we call that antigenic shift. It's all, think of being on the farm. Think being that open air market down in wherever that city was in China. Okay. What happens there, you have the potential for a confluence of having a host, a pig, a bird, a chicken, a human, and picking up viruses from other species. They come together, and as they replicate inside that individual, be they human or animal, basically they start to exchange little chunks of RNA. It's kind of that's a true antigenic shift. And when we get that happening, periodically we get what's called a novel, which means new, never had it before virus. You can also, if you want to be nefarious or experimental, experiment with that stuff in the lab, which they were doing in the lab at Google. So was it intentional? Was it a lab accident? Right now, nobody's. History may eventually tell the tale. Thankfully, hopefully we'll get past that. Everybody will be on the watch. Okay. So effectively, they're spread respiratorily. They were a common cold virus, not unlike rhinoviruses, not unlike adenoviruses. They're an enveloped virus. They're not hard to get rid of. People were, my goodness, it was scary. Someone with COVID was in this room. I'll never go in that room again. Like it was going to last year. Are you blanking kidding? But that's people for this. We've had 3 significant novel viruses. Okay, the original SARS. SARS stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome. It was called SARS-CoV coronavirus identification number 1. That happened, there was a case like that in the early 2000s where it went from China, or Japan to Toronto. And the person was on a plane with an active novel virus, and a lot of people got sick. Planes that they had to fly. If you traveled during COVID, when it was full blown, you were having to have your face and nose covered, except you were eating something on a plane. Around the time we did one of the Iraq campaigns, like 08, 07, 09, we started to have some of the, we identified it in a lot of the militaries called MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. It also was a COVID virus. We now see that in this country because, interestingly, even during the Vietnam era, a lot of, when the military folks came back, they brought some stuff, infections that we hadn't seen before. That's travel, and then COVID-19, known as SARS-CoV-2. We all know about it. So we went from something that was innocent, and why it's named COVID, why it's named coronavirus, is the external envelope and the protein spikes under the electron microscope look like a crown. Corona means crown. See, you learn something new every day. Scary, isn't it? I think so too. I'll try to get through a few more and save some of the goodies. And we really don't have as much more in this chapter as you think. These are both relatively straightforward. They're enveloped. These are the true filamentous viruses. One called rhabdo because it was shaped like a bullet. That is rabies, phyllo, Ebola. Both of these are, if you get them and they're not treated, fatal. Everybody, as far as I know, every mammal has rabies. In our environment here, the ones we worry about if someone gets, okay, the presumption if you get bitten by a dog or a cat and you do not know for certain whether it has been immunized for rabies, you will have to get treatment for it. The treatment years ago was awful. Treatment much better now. I think it's 7 to 10 days of antibody injections that are not nearly as painful as they used to. They've refined the rabies series. When I first started treating this 25 years ago, you didn't want to get that serious. People, I mean, it was just extraordinarily painful. They gave them intra-abdominal, which is not very common. Now they're, and I've had so many students who work for veterinarians who were bitten by an animal that they weren't sure had received rabies prophylaxis. They said, I had to get that at least for about 6 months. If they're bitten again, or scratched again, or somehow they're at risk again, do that. Again, so it's something depending on what you may want to do, and a lot of people love to work with animals. The ones around here that are in the wild, raccoons, foxes, bats, squirrels, bats, chipmunks. I can recall again, my daughter and we were like at a Y camp that was dads and daughters. It was kind of neat. It was very politically incorrect. I was out of the North Hills Y. It was called Indian Princesses. Now I guess they call it Native American princesses, but it was like dads and daughters, and we were all like first, second, and third grade. And they all had a great time hanging out with their dads, and the dads had a great time being away from their wives, drinking. I didn't drink a whole lot, so I was just having a good time. I ate it. Long story short, we were up at Camp David. I'm at by Mount David at the Y Camp outside of Somerset, and the chipmunks were everywhere, and the little girls are, I'm screaming. They all thought they were Alvin and Theodore. Chipmunks, those guys, Squeakle Part 2. I was around when those songs first started, in the late 50s. First time we heard of the chipmunks. Just giving you some context. Don't pet the stay a heck away from them. And that's really an important thing to understand. If you see a dead animal someplace, I'd stay away. I call the authorities and let them clean up one of those things. If it's in a park, we live in a very large wooded area along our perimeter. I've seen a few. I mean, nothing that was. I mean, seeing a deer on the roadside, same type of deal. So I would be wary about that. So that's what's to do with rabies. Be cautious about that. Effectively, this particular virus affects your brain because it's damage directly to brain cells. If it's not treated, there are different kinds of presentations like that. I mean, I shared that one with you about somebody lived in my former in-laws' neighborhood. It was a site nurse, got bitten by a guy, turned out to have rabies. She had to go through that series. Didn't I share that one with you? For real. Get these over the 50 years or so of medical encounters I've had over the years that are there. This is Ebola. We never had a case in this country until the last 5 to 7 years when there was a really big outbreak in Western Africa. And one of the doctors who were there, like from Doctors Without Borders or one of those things, who were on medical missions, got it. I mean, it was horrible, and we still don't know how it spread. That's why I'm not saying rabies is zoonotic, okay? And that's the typical way that it spread. We thought Ebola came from contaminated water. There's you could go through a whole thing. You want to go through, people would dress in effectively these encounter suits in these African hospitals, dirt floors and all that. You could tolerate them for 45 minutes. They were so hot. When you came out, you couldn't just take them off. Okay. this, the hood off, the gown off, the gloves off, that we would normally do leaving a hospital room. You had to go through a whole protocol. Someone would have to read it to you. That was how complicated the decontamination was. They didn't know how it was spread. The thought is now it's more than just fecal to oral. It can be respiratory. It can be contact with membranes. You have to be so careful. That was, and they brought this doctor back. Thankfully, there was treatment. When I first started to teach it, 80 to 90% of the people died. The way that you treated them from a health standpoint was you basically, it typically happened in a village. We thought something had fouled the water supply or the well, like a dead animal that had it, and basically you let it burn itself out. That's code for anybody who survives, survives. Anybody who dies, dies. And just keep nobody in there. Brutal, but that's what it was done. Now, probably with treatment, the survival rates are better than 50%. It's what's called a hemorrhagic fever. It hits blood vessels. Tiny blood vessels, they bleed, so you get hemorrhages. The hemorrhages clot, and it causes organs internally to die. It's accompanied by a very, very high fever. We're talking days. The only thing, a secondary case or two happened in this country. Someone was treating it. The hospital said they knew what they were doing. They didn't have to know what they're doing. The ones that went to Emory University and Georgia, fine. They knew what they were doing. Somebody says they know what they're doing, doesn't necessarily. One of the nurses got it, and there was a man that they didn't, who was actually brought it back, and they caught before he could infect 2 members. Just to give you some history about, because it's deadly. You have to know about this. I'm going to leave, obviously, HIV retrovirus for later. Bunyaviridae is something you will encounter. I'm going to get back to these. Bunya is known as hantavirus, a very potentially deadly syndrome. Typically, it was named because it came from rodent droppings, and they are aerosolized. They get into the air and they stay there. The place in this country where you have to worry about it, we have 1 or 2 cases a year in Pennsylvania from people who either from rodent infestation in a slum area in the inner cities, or from people who are effectively growing rodents for medical laboratory procedures, for research and things like that. Not a great thing for the rodent bunch. But you didn't dissect those rats because they were magically found. If you live in the desert Southwest, there are a ton of rodents. It can get aerosolized. In those dry desert conditions, there's a lot of problem with aerosolized things. Valley fever is a fungus. Hanta is one of them. They're you're very well aware of the potentiality with this in certain areas. If you live, like my brother-in-law retired and lives in Tucson. And that's an area. I mean, where you've got to be on top of what's going on there because it's dry and desert conditions. So that's where you would see it for now. That is one of the few that is spread and stays in the air for a long period of time. We won't even talk about arenaviridae. In a brief introduction, we're going to spend a lot of time with ortho. That's influenza. That's when we start talking about shifts and drifts. Okay, we're going to look more closely at it. This is the only one where I care about the strands. The enveloped virus, 7 to 8 identical strands of RNA. And yes, they can play that flip flop, and that's what we hear about swine flu. We're talking about all things that are about it. What antigenic drift is a piece here kind of swapped to a piece here. What it does, it makes tiny alterations all the time. That's why if you're getting flu shots, if you work for UPMC, my guess is you're going to be getting one. Okay, you have a choice: get one or probably work somewhere in an office that isn't very exciting. Okay. And what it does is it renders last year's flu shot useless. And to me, flu shots are more or less becoming more useless because we try to predict epidemiologically what are the 3 most likely strains, and create a vaccine that takes X number of months. You can't just create a new one. Oh, this flu season. It has to be, that's where epidemiology is. So we'll talk more about it. That's called antigenic drift. It's subtle changes. It really doesn't change the virus to something we haven't encountered. It just means each year it's a new one. Oh, I had the flu last year. I should be fine. No, don't. This year's flu virus was nasty. Whatever the shifts and, beg your pardon, drifts and changes that occurred made it particularly problematic. A lot of people, depending on who they were, and it was sort of an age independent. I remember my daughter-in-law went, she tested positive for COVID. The doctor said, I'm happy. She goes, why? She goes, this COVID's been pretty mild this time. I'm glad you didn't have influenza. Because the flu was a bear. My wife got down for about 10 days. Right after Christmas. So the Christmas to New Year's was not a big party in our household, just to give you an idea. And because in the interest of time, and I don't have enough time, I will start with paramyxo. I'll amplify the orthomyxo, and we'll spend a little nugget of time talking about retroviruses. Hep DNA, there's not a lot to say about. Thank you very much. And for some of you, you'll get lucky this afternoon at 3 o'clock. I'll be there in lab. I know you're excited.